My name is Sam Wen. I've been involved in STEM my entire life. My title is a venture partner at a venture capital firm. Venture capitalists invest in a variety of things. In particular, we invest in financial technology companies at a very early stage. And I'm also an advisor to a number of startups. So I hesitate to even call it STEM. I really liked video games. So middle school, loved a bunch of these video games. My family wasn't well off enough to really afford a computer for a long time. And when we did, we couldn't afford to buy video games. So I learned that there was this thing called QBasic in Windows. QBasic was my first programming language. And then when I started going into these magnet programs that's focused on math, science, computer science, introduced to a programming language called TrueBasic, and then learned some Java. That's the beginnings of how I developed an interest in it. Going back to video games, my initial intention was to eventually make my way to video games. In the magnet programs on the East Coast and in Maryland, there's a lot of opportunities because of all the government labs in the area to have internships there. Started with a program called CAP, and that was kind of my foot into the door of actual working. My apprenticeship program was at a place called Army Research Lab, and I pretty much did every summer at the Army Research Lab, even through college. After I graduated, I decided to take my experience in defense and go to some defense contractors and apply to them. And one that was close to home was Raytheon. So I started out my career working at Raytheon. So I went to Washington University in St. Louis. I only stayed at Raytheon for about 6 months, and then I accepted a job at Boeing in St. Louis. And at Boeing, I worked on bombs. While I was at Boeing, I had to go do something really dangerous. And then I decided it might be time for a career switch. And so I started going to grad school. And then an opportunity came out of my university where a professor of mine recommended me to work on a company with some of his friends. And that's how I started getting my feet wet with Square. Well, I guess they're called Block now. They just changed their name. But Square was a payments company. The company started off by making it so that you can plug in a device into the headphone jack of your phone and be able to accept credit cards for payment. The idea was to allow basically anybody to accept credit cards as a core part of their business. And being able to accept any kind of payment methods really helps all companies grow their revenue and grow their businesses. So that was the vision. That's what we kind of started working on the side. And when it became clear that this was going to be a real business, I left my job at Boeing and moved to the San Francisco Bay Area and started getting involved in startups. And that's kind of where I never really looked back. I absolutely love startups. My role initially was to build the hardware and to write software that could interpret the signals coming from that hardware. When the iPhone was released, right, it comes with this port on the bottom and it's advanced and has all these data capabilities. And the problem with that port is that if you are going to manufacture a piece of hardware that can take credit cards, you have to pay Apple a large fee per device that you manufacture. And you also have to do some fairly complex programming and development to make all of this work, right? And then that's not to mention the manufacturing. We wanted to avoid all of that. And one of the key ideas behind credit card processing is that, I can give you my credit card number or you can swipe it. But if you only have the numbers, the fraud rate is high. Whereas if you have this physical means of swiping the data on the card or whatever, they're considered more secure transactions. And so why is this important? Well, the charge that the credit card companies have on more secure transactions is lower than on more risky transactions. That's why we wanted to develop an actual swiper, right? So that we could get to that cheaper transaction and make our merchants more money. So my initial role was to develop that piece of hardware, and we wanted to do it as cheaply as possible without going through the Apple rails that I mentioned before. So we looked at the phone and we said, look, there's this headphone jack, right? And as an electrical engineer, what you understand is that there is no such thing as an audio signal or a video signal. They're just signals. They're just voltages, and depending on how you interpret those voltages, you can get to different results. The traditional way an audio jack would interpret those voltages is it vibrates a membrane in order to give you sound. However, if we ignored vibrating a membrane and just looked at the data, we can get perhaps numbers of the credit card or the data that was resident on the card that way. So what we did was we had to build a very simple piece of hardware. That hardware is effectively just an inductor and a resistor in series. Put some pretty housing on it. connected to a headphone jack. And then that data would receive signals through the microphone port, send that data in to our app. And then our app would take that data, store it, and then interpret it as binary data. So that was what I did initially at Square. Over the years, I worked on almost all things technical at the company. I worked on front end, I worked on web development, I worked on iOS programming, I worked on Android programming. So I really took the opportunity to learn as much as I could about sort of modern programming and building consumer apps and consumer devices, and just got involved all across the company. So Green Visor Capital is a venture capital firm. Venture capital doesn't always imply tech, but it almost always implies startup. We focus on a sector specifically called financial technology, or fintech for short. And this is an area where I have a lot of experience in, given my time at Square. Basically, in the business of venture capital, there's really three things that you're doing. The first is a very obvious thing: you have to invest into companies, right? The second is that you have to look at the companies that you've invested in and try to help them where it makes sense. We call that portfolio support. And the third function is to solicit investors to put money into your fund so that you can continue to make investments. In terms of my role here, I do a little bit of work on the soliciting investors side. I spend probably most of my time on portfolio support. So I love, again, I'm more on the entrepreneurial side. I like to start companies and run companies and build companies. I spend a lot of time helping our portfolio companies wherever they might need help. This has ranged over the years from actually programming an iOS app for them to helping recommend structures for how they can organize an engineering team. And then I spend a little bit of time as well finding new investments. That's basically the role of a partner at a venture capital firm. I had a very common misperception when I first entered the workforce, in that I very, very much valued engineering above all else, right? Like, engineering has very well developed ideas on how you build something, on how you break up problems, and how you think about solutions to problems. And I think that's going to help anybody, throughout their careers. I think what's really interesting when I moved into the venture capital side of things is that with engineering, you can always maybe come up with the correct answer, right? Implement a button that glows, right? Like, many different solutions to that, but you can come up with a solution that will achieve the desired effect. When it came to doing work in investing, it's a very, very different thought process and personality, in that it's not easy. Perhaps the work itself is not, technically difficult. You don't need to do any integration. You don't need to take a line integral. You don't need to do any of these particularly technically difficult things. However, what you do have to deal with is a lot of uncertainty, right? In engineering, a lot of times you have some certainty. There are certain things that you can just say, okay, that's probably impossible, and I'm not even going to waste my time doing that. And then there's certain other tasks, which is okay, I can eventually get to a correct solution. In investing, and I would say in the business world at large, you have to deal with uncertainty. So if you're a salesperson, right, that might seem on the surface level very easy, but as an entrepreneur, I've had to do sales of my company. I had to solicit investors. I have to solicit investors today. And the uncertainty of going out and spending time and doing something that may not be productive is something that you're constantly dealing with. And frankly, I don't like it that much, but it's a necessity of getting things moving. I think the biggest learning in that transition is, whereas with engineering, there's a lot of pride in being able to get stuff done. When it comes to the business side of things, when it comes to investing, it's really how you manage the idea of this type of uncertainty, and how you, to the best of your ability with the limited information you have, spend your time to maximize your results. And business people have it tough, right? If that fails for some reason, or if you fail for some reason, you're going to get fired regardless of whether or not somebody else can come up with a better solution. I think that was the biggest sort of interesting insight that I've had over the years, and sort of transitioning between sort of a purely technical role into more of a business role. Typically in finance positions like venture capital or hedge funds or whatever, there's a tremendous focus on a sales background. That's something that's very, very important, right? Because you're doing sales all day, whether or not you're trying to convince a startup to accept your money, to convincing somebody that you are going to do the best job of investing their money. Sales is a really big part of just making the business tick. But I think one of the big differentiators for me is my background in engineering. I come from like a culture, right? Just within engineering of no nonsense, direct conversations, right? There's no like open faced compliment sandwich, from where I come from, right? Like you're not like, well, you're pretty good at this, but like you kind of suck at this, but it's all okay because you're also good at this, right? The compliment sandwich. It's just like, hey man, this code is terrible, right? Like, why did you do it this way? Fix it. And then you really come to appreciate that no nonsense way of getting to the solution quickly. And I think that's kind of the kernel for a lot of how I come across with entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurs, like really good ones, kind of no nonsense, right? They can turn on the salesmanship and the charisma when they need to, but when they're discussing problems or when they're trying to problem solve, none of this flowery stuff. I think that gives me, an edge in my industry because I can speak the language of entrepreneurs. STEM is just such a fascinating field to me. I mean, I started off my interest in video games, but I love like reading about quantum computing, for example. There's so much amazing stuff happening, both in helping us improve our understanding of the universe, but also, doing things that are incredibly powerful and useful for people, right? I haven't been involved in the most world-shattering things, but you have sort of inspirational figures like Elon Musk trying to like save humanity by giving us an out in space before we destroy our planet, right? To people actually trying to help build sustainable ways that we can continue to live on our planet. Like one of the big dreams for us at Square was that when we simplify all of the stuff about running a business, then you can focus on the thing that you wanted to do with your business in the first place. Like if you wanted to sell flowers, do you really want to care about payroll and accounts receivable and accounting? And like, do you really want to do all those things? Like, pretty sure you just wanted to like, have the nicest flowers and you wanted to sell them, right? And so a big part of that idea was like, how can we help people free their minds of the boilerplate minutia that just sucks? Every April, the amount of brain drain, right, from people doing creative and interesting things goes to doing their taxes. And like, the government is like, we know how much you owe us, but why don't you tell us how much you think you owe us? And then if you're wrong, well, you're in trouble. But if you're right, then that's like there's so many examples of these things that get in the way of people's creativity. Technology, science, like all of these things are supporting functions to help us free our minds so that we can be creative and we can save the planet and we can build interesting new businesses and we can get to Mars. STEM is difficult, but once you wrap your minds around these things, right, it helps to make us move faster. It helps to make things more efficient for people. And anytime you make things more efficient for people, you're effectively extending their life. There are ways outside of medicine to extend a person's life. So, STEM is really important for us to continue to solve these types of issues. You should keep that in mind. Find something that you're really passionate about, keep at it, and get into STEM. You can always go into business later like I did.